Frank Mallerie, a humble 71-year-old Marine veteran, faces mockery from young men at a gas station for his old truck and age. Unfazed, he drives off, his silence hiding a heroic past. The next morning, Marines, led by Captain Riley, block the young men's SUVs, revealing Frank's valor in Afghanistan, where he saved lives under fire. The confrontation draws a crowd, and a little girl's outburst hints at Frank's bravery. As the truth unfolds, the young men's arrogance crumbles. What secrets does Frank still carry, and how will this moment change Carson Springs forever? Love stories of honor and justice? Subscribe to QH's incredible stories. Share Frank's tale with someone who believes in doing what brash. Your support helps us uncover more inspiring stories of quiet heroes. Join our community, comment honor, and let's celebrate those who make a difference. Frank Mallerie's hands, etched with the lines of a life well lived, curled around the steering wheel of his 1984 Ford pickup with a tenderness born of decades. At 71, his joints ached with the weight of years, but his grip was steady, his eyes sharp, scanning the road with the vigilance of a man who'd never lost his edge. The truck, its silver paint peeling like old skin, groaned with every turn, its engine coughing a familiar rhythm that Frank had long since memorized. This vehicle wasn't just a machine, it was a relic of his past, a partner through countless miles, carrying memories of deliveries, late-night repairs, and a life of quiet service. After 20 years in the U.S. Marine Corps as a logistics specialist, Frank had traded battlefields for backroads, settling into the rhythm of Riverdale, a small town where folks knew him as the dependable guy who'd show up with a package or a wrench. No questions asked. His mobile home, modest and tidy, sat on the edge of town, a reflection of the man himself, unassuming, disciplined, and enduring. Each morning, Frank rose at 5:00 a.m., his internal clock as precise as ever, no alarm needed. He folded his blankets with the same crisp precision he'd learned in the Corps, the motions automatic yet deliberate, a small ritual that grounded him. His days were filled with deliveries across county lines, or fixing engines for neighbors too strapped to pay a shop. He never grumbled about the early starts or the late-night calls when someone's car broke down on a back road. To the people of Riverdale, Frank was a constant, like the sunrise, his comings and goings so reliable they could have set their clocks by him. But this Tuesday was different. Frank was on a long-haul delivery, one that meant an overnight stop far from home. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and gray, he pulled into Hillside Gas and Market, a weathered station off Interstate 40 near Carson Springs. His truck needed fuel, and his back, stiff from hours on the road, begged for a moment's rest. As Frank maneuvered his pickup to the pumps, the station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the lot. Nearby, 3 sleek black SUVs gleamed, their polished surfaces a stark contrast to the faded grid of Frank's truck. A group of young men, clad in high-end outdoor gear, leaned against their vehicles, their laughter cutting through the evening air. They were in their mid-20s, their voices loud with the confidence of youth and privilege. Likely weekend adventurers fresh from some thrill-seeking trip. Frank barely noticed them at first, his focus on the pump, the rhythmic click of the nozzle as it filled his tank. But as he stepped away to pay, their voices grew sharper, their words slicing through the quiet. "Look at that rust bucket," one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. He was tall, maybe 25, his designer fleece jacket and sunglasses, worn despite the fading light, marking him as someone who cared more about appearances than practicality. His friends chuckled, egged on by the group's energy and the faint smell of beer lingering in the air. "Is that thing even street legal? It's a museum piece, not a truck." The words hit Frank like a gust of cold wind, but he kept walking, his steps slow but steady, his face a mask of calm. Inside, though, a flicker of irritation stirred, not at the insult to his truck, but at the casual cruelty of it, the way these strangers assumed they could judge a man's worth by the vehicle he drove. Inside the gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the shelves of snacks and motor oil. The cashier, a kid barely out of high school, fidgeted behind the counter, his eyes darting toward the window where the young men's laughter echoed. An older woman in line, her arms crossed, gave a subtle shake of her head, Her lips pursed in disapproval, but she said nothing. Frank approached the counter, his movements deliberate, pulling his worn leather wallet from his pocket. "That'll be $43.75, the cashier muttered, avoiding Frank's gaze as if embarrassed by the scene unfolding outside. Frank counted out exact change, each bill and coin placed with care, and nodded his thanks. His expression remained unreadable, but inside he felt the weight of their words pressing against the quiet pride he carried. He'd heard worse in his life, far worse, but there was something about the smugness of these young men that gnawed at him, a reminder of a world that sometimes forgot the value of things worn but enduring. Back outside, the group's taunts grew bolder as Frank approached his truck. One of them, emboldened by his friend's laughter, rapped his knuckles against the truck's door, the sound sharp and disrespectful. "Hey, old-timer," he called, his voice laced with mockery. "Retirement not working out, or are you just too stubborn to stop driving before you cause an accident?" The others laughed, their gestures exaggerated, as they pretended to cover their ears when Frank started the engine. The truck sputtered twice before settling into its familiar rumble, a sound that to Frank was as comforting as an old friend's voice. He didn't look at them, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he checked his mirrors, clicked his seatbelt into place, and shifted into gear. As he rolled past, he lowered his window just a fraction, his voice low, almost a whisper, meant more for himself than for them. "It's old, sure," he said, his tone steady but laced with a quiet defiance. "But it's carried things you wouldn't believe." The words hung in the air as he pulled onto the highway, the truck's taillights fading into the deepening dusk. Behind him, the young men exchanged glances, some smirking, others shrugging, their brief amusement already fading as they returned to their banter. To them, Frank was just a passing figure, an old man in a beat-up truck, easily forgotten. They couldn't have known that their words had stirred something deeper, a ripple that would spread far beyond that gas station lot. Nor could they have imagined the kind of man they'd just dismissed, a man whose quiet strength had once commanded the respect of those who knew the true weight of duty. At the counter, the young cashier leaned toward the station's owner, Mrs. Bailey, a woman whose sharp eyes had watched the entire exchange from behind the register. Her face, lined with years of observing the comings and goings of travelers, softened with a mix of admiration and concern. "Mrs. Bailey Baum," the cashier said quietly. "That was Frank Mallerie, wasn't it?" She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the spot where Frank's truck had disappeared. In her mind, she saw not just the old man in the worn pickup, but the Marine he'd once been, the one who'd carried burdens heavier than any of those young men could fathom. She knew, as they did not, that Frank's silence wasn't weakness. It was the kind of restraint that only comes from a life of hard-earned discipline. And she wondered, as the SUVs pulled out and the night settled in, what consequences might follow when you underestimate a man like Frank. The name slipped from Jason Riley's lips in a hushed whisper, heavy with awe. Frank Mallerie. His uncle had spun tales about a man who'd served alongside him in the blistering sands of Afghanistan, a figure who loomed larger than life in the stories shared over late-night beers. According to Uncle Mike, Frank was the kind of Marine who didn't just follow orders. He carved paths through chaos, saving lives when the odds were stacked against them. To Jason, standing behind the counter of Hillside Gas and Market, the name carried the weight of myth. But the man who'd just driven off in that weathered truck didn't look like a legend. He was quiet, unassuming, his face etched with lines that spoke of years spent carrying burdens most would never understand. Mrs. Bailey, wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better days, gave a slow nod, her eyes distant. "Some folks think age dulls a man, makes him soft," she said, her voice low but steady. "They don't get it. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Sometimes it means you've seen so much, too much, that you don't need to shout about it. You don't need to prove a damn thing." Her words hung in the air, mingling with the faint hum of the gas station's fluorescent lights. She'd seen plenty in her years running this place, watched people come and go, their stories written in the way they carried themselves. Frank, she knew, was one of those rare souls who let his actions speak louder than any boast ever could. "When the world turns its back," she added, almost to herself, "all you've got left is your conscience. That's what keeps a man like Frank going." Jason's gaze lingered on the doorway where Frank had disappeared, his old pickup truck kicking up dust as it rolled down the highway. The unease churning in his gut refused to settle. He couldn't stop replaying what he'd witnessed earlier. Three young guys in flashy SUVs, their laughter sharp and mocking as they taunted Frank at the pump. They'd banged on his truck's hood, jeering about his slow movements, calling him Grandpa, with a sneer that made Jason's blood simmer. Frank hadn't flinched, hadn't raised his voice. He'd just fixed them with a steady look, paid for his grin, and driven off into the dusk. But Jason couldn't let it go. Those guys didn't know who they'd just disrespected. His uncle's stories echoed in his mind, tales of a marine transport driver who'd braved ambushes to get his convoy through, who'd pulled wounded men from the wreckage of a blasted road. That was Frank Mallerie. And now he lived here in Carson Springs, blending into the background like he wanted to be forgotten. "Mrs. Bailey," Jason said, his voice tight, "those guys need to know who they messed with." He glanced out the window where the three SUVs were still parked, their owners now sprawled in a booth at the diner next door, their laughter spilling through the glass. Mrs. Bailey shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Not your fight, Jason. If Frank wanted to make a scene, he would have. He's not the kind to need attention." Her tone was firm, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, pride maybe, or sadness for a world that didn't always see men like Frank for what they were. Jason nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. He turned back to his work, restocking cigarette packs and wiping down the register, but his thoughts kept circling back to Frank, to the stories, to the injustice of it all. Through the diner's wide windows, Jason could see the three young men, their gestures wild and exaggerated as they recounted their run-in with Frank. One of them, a lanky guy with a backward cap, hunched over an imaginary steering wheel, mimicking an old man's trembling hands. Another pretended to nod off, slumping dramatically in his seat, and their table exploded with laughter that grated against Jason's nerves. They were oblivious to the faded military ID dangling from Frank's rearview mirror, its edges worn from years of quiet pride. They didn't notice the small Marine Corps emblem on the back window of his truck, a subtle nod to a life of service that didn't demand recognition. To them, Frank was just an old man, a punchline, but to Jason he was a reminder of something bigger. Duty, sacrifice, the kind of strength that didn't need to flex to prove itself. Miles down the road, Frank pulled into the gravel lot of the Pinewood Motel, its neon sign flickering weakly against the twilight. The place was modest, its walls weathered by years of desert wind, but it suited him. He didn't need much, a bed, a roof, a moment to breathe. He carried his small duffel bag inside, arranging his belongings with the precision of a man who'd spent years in uniform. Socks folded just so, toothbrush aligned with his razor. It was a ritual, a way to anchor himself in a world that often felt too chaotic. Sitting on the edge of the creaky bed, he pulled out his wallet, his fingers moving with the care of someone handling something sacred. Behind his driver's license was a photograph, its corners softened by time. 4 Marines stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a dusty transport truck, their faces sunburned and grinning despite the weight of their gear. Frank's thumb brushed over their faces, lingering on each one. He didn't linger long, just enough to feel the ache of memory, the weight of loss and camaraderie woven together. Then he tucked the photo away, turned off the lamp, and lay down, letting the quiet of the night settle over him. Back at Hillside Gas and Market, Jason's shift dragged to a close at 10 p.m. The diner had emptied out, save for the 3 young men who'd finally paid their tab and stumbled back to their SUVs, their steps unsteady from one too many beers. They weren't driving, at least, not yet. Jason overheard them laughing as they climbed into their vehicles, planning to sleep it off in the parking lot before hitting the road in the morning. Their voices carried on the night air, careless and loud. "Man, that old dude's face when you banged on his truck. Priceless," one of them said, chuckling. "Probably the most excitement he's had in years." Another chimed in, "Should have told him we'd call an ambulance if that junker of his broke down." The words hit Jason like a punch. He climbed into his own car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. For several minutes he sat there, engine off, wrestling with a decision that felt bigger than himself. Finally, he pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen before he dialed. "Uncle Mike," he said when the call connected, his voice low but resolute. "It's Jason. Sorry to call so late. There's something I need to ask you about." Morning broke over Carson Springs, the sky clear and sharp with the bite of early cold. The three young men emerged from their SUVs, bleary-eyed and stretching, their hangovers evident in the way they winced at the sunlight. They shuffled into the gas station, used the restrooms, and grabbed coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Their banter quieter now, but still laced with bravado. Tyler, the one who seemed to call the shots, checked his phone and muttered, "Let's get moving. I've got meetings tomorrow. I can't miss." They piled into their SUVs, forming a small convoy as they pulled out of the lot, heading toward the interstate on-ramp. The road stretched out before them, open and unassuming, until they reached the first intersection. Two military Humvees sat squarely across the road, their bulk unmistakable. 6 Marines in crisp uniforms stood beside them, their postures rigid, their faces unreadable. Tyler's SUV slowed to a stop, the others pulling up behind him. "What the hell?" he muttered, his hands tightening on the wheel. A Marine officer stepped forward, his movements precise, his expression calm but unyielding. The name on his uniform read, Captain Michael Riley, Jason's uncle. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud. "I need to see identification from all 3 drivers who were at Hillside Gas and Market last evening." Tyler's confusion tipped into unease, his fingers fumbling as he reached for his wallet. "What's this about? We didn't do anything wrong." His voice carried a defensive edge, but it wavered under the officer's steady gaze. "Identification, please," Captain Riley repeated, his tone unchanged. Behind him, the other Marines stood watchful, their presence a quiet force. A small crowd was starting to gather, locals drawn by the unusual sight of military vehicles in their sleepy town, travelers diverted by the roadblock. Tyler handed over his license, his jaw tight. A young girl, maybe 10, slipped away from her mother in the crowd, her eyes wide with curiosity as she craned her neck to see what was happening. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, and for the first time the 3 young men seemed to sense that their careless laughter from the night before might have consequences they hadn't imagined. The crowd swelled as a young girl's voice cut through the murmurs, her words ringing with innocent pride. "That's Mr. Mallalerie," she shouted, her small frame bouncing with excitement as she pointed toward the unfolding scene. "He saved those soldiers who were trapped." Her mother, flustered, swiftly pulled her back, but the spark had already ignited. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, drawing more curious faces from nearby shops and homes. The air buzzed with anticipation, a mix of awe and intrigue, as the story of a quiet hero began to unravel in the heart of the small town. Captain Riley stood tall, his presence commanding yet measured, as he scrutinized the driver's licenses of the 3 young men seated in their sleek SUV. Tyler, the driver, shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. His friends, Jake and Ethan, avoided eye contact, their earlier bravado replaced by a gnawing unease. The weight of the captain's gaze pressed down on them, and the growing crowd only amplified their discomfort. Riley's voice was steady but firm as he addressed them, each word deliberate. "Gentlemen, last night at Hillside Gas and Market, you crossed paths with a man driving a 1984 Ford pickup truck. Instead of treating him with basic courtesy, you chose to mock him. His age, his vehicle, his very existence." Tyler's throat tightened. He forced a weak shrug, his voice barely above a mutter. "Look, we were just messing around, no big deal." His words hung in the air, flimsy and unconvincing. Riley's expression darkened, a subtle shift that sent a chill through the trio. "No big deal," he repeated, his tone laced with restrained intensity. "The man you ridiculed is Frank Mallerie, former staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. A man who earned the Bronze Star with a combat distinguishing device for extraordinary valor." The captain paused, his piercing gaze locking onto each of the young men in turn. Tyler's stomach churned as he felt the crowd's eyes on him, their silence deafening. Riley's voice grew heavier, carrying the weight of a story that demanded to be heard. "In 2004, in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Mallalerie was driving a supply truck when his convoy came under ambush. Enemy fire rained down, relentless and chaotic. Most drivers froze, unwilling to risk their lives. But not Frank. He drove his truck through that hellscape, Not once, not twice, but 3 times, to pull wounded Marines to safety and recover critical communications equipment. The crowd, now larger, stood motionless, hanging on every word. Riley's voice softened slightly, but the gravity remained. 7 Marines, including myself, are alive today because of his courage. On his final run, he took a hit. Shrapnel tore into him, but he refused medical evacuation until every last Marine was accounted for. He put us before himself every step of the way. Tyler's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. The memory of last night's laughter, their cruel jabs at the old geezer in the rusty truck, now felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Jake stared at his sneakers, his face burning with shame. Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind racing to find an excuse, but none came. The mockery that had seemed so harmless in the moment now loomed over them, an ugly truth they couldn't escape. Riley straightened, his military bearing unmistakable. Staff Sergeant Mallalerie never sought fame or glory for what he did. After his honorable discharge, he chose a quiet life, serving his community in ways most people never notice. He's never leveraged his status as a decorated veteran for personal gain or special treatment. He simply lives with the same integrity he showed on that battlefield. The captain's voice carried a quiet reverence, a tribute to a man who embodied honor without fanfare. As if summoned by the weight of the moment, the familiar rumble of a 1984 Ford pickup truck echoed from the opposite end of the intersection. The crowd stirred, heads turning as Frank Mallerie's weathered vehicle came into view. Unaware of the drama unfolding, Frank slowed his truck, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The sight of military vehicles in a gathered crowd sent a flicker of concern across his face. He was no stranger to tense situations, but this felt different, unfamiliar, almost surreal. With deliberate care, he shifted the truck into park and stepped out, his posture straight despite the years etched into his frame. His boots hit the pavement with a quiet resolve, a man accustomed to facing the unknown head-on. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. "There he is, that's Frank Mallerie." The words carried a mix of admiration and disbelief, as if the man before them couldn't possibly be the hero they'd just heard about. Frank's brow furrowed, his confusion deepening as he registered the attention. His gaze darted to the military vehicles, then to Captain Riley, recognition flickering in his eyes. Riley snapped to attention, rendering a crisp salute that spoke volumes, a gesture of profound respect from one Marine to another. Frank hesitated, caught off guard by the formality, but instinct took over. He returned the salute with the precision of a man who had never forgotten his training, his movements steady despite the weight of years. The crowd watched in reverent silence, the moment charged with unspoken gratitude. "Staff Sergeant Mallalerie," Riley said, his voice formal but warm. "It's an honor to see you again, sir." Frank's voice was low, steady, but tinged with uncertainty. "Captain, what's going on here? Is there trouble?" His eyes scanned the scene again, searching for answers. No trouble, Staff Sergeant," Riley replied, his tone reassuring. "We're just here to set the record straight about who you are and what you've done." Frank's gaze shifted to the 3 young men in the SUV, and understanding began to dawn. His weathered face softened, but there was a trace of discomfort in his expression. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, and this public reckoning felt unnecessary to him. "This isn't needed, Captain," he said quietly, almost dismissively. "It's water under the bridge." "With respect, sir, I disagree," Riley countered, his voice firm but respectful. He turned to Tyler, Jake, and Ethan, who remained seated, their faces a mix of dread and resignation. "These gentlemen have something they'd like to say to you." Tyler's heart pounded as he realized what was expected. Swallowing hard, he stepped out of the SUV, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. Jake and Ethan followed, their eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet Frank's steady gaze. Tyler cleared his throat, the word "sir" feeling foreign and awkward on his tongue. "Sir, we want to apologize for how we acted yesterday. We were out of line, disrespectful. We didn't know." His voice faltered, the weight of his own words pressing down on him. Frank studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head slightly, a faint trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't know me," he said simply. "No harm done." His voice was calm, almost forgiving, but it carried an undercurrent of wisdom that made Tyler's chest tighten. Riley stepped forward, his tone gentle but resolute. "That's not the point, sir. Respect isn't something we reserve for those whose stories we know. It's what we owe to everyone, especially our elders, who've carried burdens we can't even imagine." Ethan, who had been silent until now, took a hesitant step forward. His voice was shaky, but there was a raw sincerity in his words. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," he said, his eyes finally lifting to meet Frank's. "If someone treated him the way we treated you—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought, his face contorted with regret. The image of his grandfather, a man he'd always admired, being mocked by careless strangers hit him harder than he expected. Frank's gaze softened as he looked at the three young men. He saw their shame, their discomfort, and something else, potential. They were young, reckless, but not irredeemable. He'd seen worse in war zones, men who'd made mistakes but found their way back to honor. "You're here now," he said, his voice steady. "That's what matters." The crowd remained silent, but the air felt lighter, as if Frank's words had lifted a weight from the moment. Tyler's shoulders slumped, a mix of relief and lingering guilt washing over him. Jake nodded faintly, as if Frank's forgiveness had given him permission to breathe again. Ethan wiped at his eyes, embarrassed by the sting of tears he couldn't quite hide. Riley turned to Frank, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Staff Sergeant, your actions, then and now, remind us what it means to serve with honor. We're here because we believe in recognizing that, especially when it's been overlooked." Frank nodded, accepting the words but still uneasy with the attention. He glanced at his truck, as if longing to climb back in and drive away from the spotlight. But he stayed, standing tall, a quiet testament to the strength that had carried him through war and beyond. As the scene unfolded in the heart of Carson Springs, a small crowd had begun to form, drawn by the unexpected gravity of the moment. The air was thick with anticipation, and the murmurs of curious onlookers grew as more townsfolk arrived. Among them were several veterans, their faces etched with a quiet understanding of the significance of what was happening. Word had spread quickly, and a reporter from the Carson Springs Gazette was now live streaming the event on the newspaper's social media page, capturing every word and gesture for an audience far beyond the town's borders. Captain Riley stood tall, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the growing crowd. "Many of you may not realize this," he began, his eyes sweeping over the faces before him. "But you've been living alongside a true hero all these years." His words carried a weight that silenced the whispers. In 2004, Staff Sergeant Frank Mallerie was serving as a transport driver in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. His actions during Operation Mountain Resolve saved countless lives, including my own. The captain's voice softened as he began to recount the events of that fateful day, his words painting a vivid picture of chaos and courage. A forward operating base had come under relentless attack, leaving several Marines stranded behind enemy lines. The situation was dire. Rescue attempts had failed, one after another, as heavy enemy fire turned the only access road into a deadly gauntlet. The wounded were running out of time, their survival hanging by a thread. Captain Riley's gaze grew distant, as if he were back in that moment, reliving the desperation and the stakes. "Staff Sergeant Mallerie volunteered to drive the last operational transport through that hellfire," he said, his voice steady but laced with awe. He was explicitly ordered to wait for air support, but he knew the wounded wouldn't last that long. He made a choice, one that most wouldn't have dared. Frank Mallerie stood off to the side, his weathered hands stuffed into the pockets of his faded flannel shirt. His face was a mask of discomfort, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance, as if he could will himself away from the spotlight. The weight of the captain's words seemed to press down on him, stirring memories he'd long buried. The screams of the wounded, the crack of gunfire, the acrid smell of smoke. They flickered through his mind, unbidden. He hadn't thought of himself as a hero then, and he certainly didn't now. He'd just done what needed doing, what any Marine would have done, or so he told himself. Captain Riley pressed on, his voice rising with conviction. Frank drove through an active firefight, loaded 7 wounded Marines into his vehicle, and brought them to safety. But that wasn't enough for him. When he learned critical communications equipment had been left behind, he went back in. And when we realized one Marine was still unaccounted for, he went in a third time. A ripple of awe passed through the crowd, a collective intake of breath. The townsfolk, many of whom had known Frank only as the quiet man who drove an old pickup and kept to himself, now saw him in a new light. Their murmurs grew into a soft hum of respect, their eyes wide with disbelief and admiration. Riley's voice grew somber as he described that final run. His vehicle took multiple hits. Staff Sergeant Mallerie sustained shrapnel wounds to his left side, jagged metal tearing into his flesh. But he kept driving. He refused to stop until he'd reached safety, and even then he wouldn't accept medical evacuation until every single one of the men he'd rescued had been treated. The captain paused, letting the weight of Frank's sacrifice settle over the crowd. Frank's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists inside his pockets. The pain of those wounds had faded long ago, but the memory of that day, the faces of the men he'd saved, the ones he couldn't, still lingered, sharp and unyielding. Turning to face Frank directly, Captain Riley's voice softened, but it carried a fierce sincerity. "Sir, we never properly thanked you. The mission was classified, the paperwork got lost in the shuffle, and by the time things settled, you'd already rotated back home and left the service. You slipped through the cracks, and that's on us." Frank's eyes flickered briefly to meet the captain's, but he said nothing. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy with a mix of gratitude and unease. He'd never sought recognition, never wanted it. The past was the past, and he'd done his best to leave it there. Finally, Frank spoke, his voice low and steady, though it carried the faintest tremor. "I was just doing my job, Captain, same as any Marine would have done." The words were simple, but they came from a place of deep conviction. To Frank, there was no heroism in what he'd done, just duty, plain and simple. He'd seen too many good men fall to believe otherwise. Riley shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's where you're wrong, sir. I was there. I saw other drivers refuse the mission. What you did was extraordinary, even by Marine Corps standards." His words were firm, brooking no argument. At a signal from the captain, a muster Marine stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the pavement. In his hands was a small wooden box, its polished surface catching the morning light. He opened it with care, revealing a medal draped on a blue ribbon, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with a Combat V device, gleaming with quiet pride. Riley's voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "This should have been presented to you years ago. We've corrected that oversight now. On behalf of the United States Marine Corps and the men whose lives you saved, I'm honored to finally give you the recognition you earned." He stepped forward, pinning the medal to Frank's flannel shirt with steady hands. The crowd fell silent, the air heavy with the solemnity of the moment. The gathered Marines snapped to attention, their salutes crisp and unwavering, a silent tribute to one of their own. Frank stood rigid, his eyes glistening but unyielding. The weight of the medal against his chest felt foreign, almost intrusive. He didn't know what to do with the gratitude, the reverence, the sudden shift in how the world saw him. He'd spent years blending into the background, content to be just another face in Carson Springs. Now the town's eyes were on him, and he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't since that day in Kandahar. Nearby, Tyler and his friends stood at the edge of the crowd, their earlier bravado gone. The weight of their actions the previous day pressed down on them, a bitter mix of shame and regret. They'd mocked Frank, called him an old man, dismissed him as insignificant based on his weathered truck and quiet demeanor. Now they saw the truth. He was a man of courage, of sacrifice, the kind of person they could only dream of becoming. Tyler's stomach churned, his face hot with embarrassment. He wanted to disappear, to undo the careless words he'd flung so thoughtlessly. His friends shifted uncomfortably beside him, their eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet Frank's gaze. As the ceremony concluded, the mood shifted, becoming something warmer, more communal. Townsfolk who had never known Frank's story approached him, their hands extended in gratitude. Veterans in the crowd sought him out, their words quiet but heavy with shared understanding. There was a bond there, unspoken but palpable, forged in the crucible of service. The impromptu gathering began to migrate toward the gas station where the incident had sparked this moment. Mrs. Bailey, the owner, stood at the door, her face beaming with pride. Coffee and breakfast are on the house for anyone who wants to hear more about our local hero, she announced, her voice carrying across the lot. The crowd cheered, the sound warm and genuine. Tyler lingered at the edge of the group, his heart pounding as he watched Frank shake hands and exchange quiet words with those around him. The sight of the medal pinned to Frank's shirt burned in his mind, a stark reminder of his own foolishness. He couldn't walk away. Not yet. He needed to say something, to make amends, though he wasn't sure any words could undo the damage. Steeling himself, he approached Frank, his steps hesitant. "Sir," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say, except that I'm ashamed of how we acted yesterday." His eyes dropped to the ground, unable to hold Frank's steady gaze. "We judged you based on your age, your truck. We thought we knew who you were, and we couldn't have been more wrong." Frank studied the young man for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Tyler's words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Frank's mind flickered back to his own youth, to the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned the hard way. "You know what the toughest lesson I learned in the Marines was?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Tyler shook his head, his eyes wide with curiosity and apprehension. "Character isn't about how you act when everyone's watching," Frank continued. "It's about what you do when you think nobody is. Yesterday, you thought nobody who mattered was watching." Tyler swallowed hard, the truth of Frank's words cutting deep. "I understand that now, sir," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. Frank nodded, a faint softening in his eyes. "Good," he said. Then something worthwhile came out of all this fuss. At the gas station, the gathering had taken on a festive air, the clink of coffee mugs and the hum of conversation filling the space. People crowded around Frank, eager to hear more, though he deflected their questions with his usual quiet humility. For Frank, the hoe was a whirlwind of emotions: pride, discomfort, gratitude, and a quiet resolve to carry on as he always had. For Tyler, it was a turning point, a moment that would shape the man he hoped to become. And for Carson Springs, it was a reminder that heroes often walk among us, unnoticed until their stories come to light. In the heart of Carson Springs, a spontaneous town hall gathering unfolded, drawing a crowd eager to honor a man whose quiet strength had reshaped their understanding of heroism. Captain Riley stood before the townsfolk, his voice steady as he recounted the details of Frank Mallerie's service. Decades of sacrifice etched into medals and memories that Frank had never boasted about. The locals, many of whom had known Frank for years as the unassuming man in the weathered Ford pickup, listened in stunned silence. Their astonishment wasn't just at the bravery he'd shown in distant battlefields, but at the humility that had kept such stories locked away in his heart. Neighbors exchanged glances, their faces a mix of awe and guilt for never suspecting the depth of the man who'd fixed their engines or delivered their packages without fanfare. Each revelation about Frank's past stirred a quiet reckoning within them, a realization that true valor often wears the plainest clothes. The air grew thick with emotion when a young boy, no older than 8, stepped forward, clutching a handmade card adorned with the crayon scribbles. His small frame trembled with nervous pride as he looked up at Frank. "My dad was a Marine too," he said, his voice cleared despite the quiver. "He told me real heroes don't need to talk about what they did. I never understood what he meant until today." The boy's words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, carrying the weight of a child's earnest admiration. His father's wisdom, passed down through generations, now found a new home in this moment. Frank, his weathered face softening, knelt slightly to meet the boy's gaze. He accepted the card with the same solemn grace he'd shown when receiving his medal years before, his hand steady, but his eyes betraying a flicker of emotion. Pride, perhaps, or the quiet ache of memory stirred. "Your dad sounds like a wise man," Frank said gently. "You hold on to that wisdom, son." The exchange was brief, but it pierced the hearts of everyone watching, a reminder that courage and kindness often speak in whispers. By mid-afternoon, what had begun as a tense confrontation, a moment where Frank's quiet dignity had been mistaken for weakness, had blossomed into a celebration of service and character. The town square buzzed with a newfound reverence, not just for Frank, but for the countless others whose silent sacrifices had gone unnoticed. Word of the gathering spread like wildfire across social media, with the hashtag #respect the quiet ones climbing regional trends. Strangers shared posts about Frank's story, their words laced with admiration for a man who'd never sought the spotlight. Local veterans groups, inspired by the outpouring of respect, began planning a formal ceremony to honor Frank's contributions. The town council, caught up in the moment, proposed renaming a stretch of highway after him, a gesture meant to etch his legacy into the very roads he'd traveled so humbly. At the Hillside Gas and Market, Mrs. Bailey, ever the opportunist with a heart of gold, had a new sign installed above the entrance, where a hero once stood silent. The words, simple yet profound, captured the essence of Frank's impact. A man who'd needed no fanfare to prove his worth. Frank, for his part, accepted the accolades with the same unassuming grace that defined him. When the crowd pressed him to speak, thrusting a microphone into his hands, he stood quietly for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "I appreciate all this attention, though I never sought it," he began, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd seen more than he'd ever spoken of. "The truth is, I'm no different from countless other veterans who did their job when called upon. Some received recognition, many didn't. The medal doesn't make the Marine, the willingness to serve does." He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze softening as he took in the crowd. Friends, neighbors, strangers, all united by his story. "If you want to honor me, do it by remembering that the measure of a person isn't in how they look, what they drive, or how loud they speak. It's in how they act when faced with the choice between what's easy and what's right." His words, delivered without flourish, landed like a sermon, stirring hearts and prompting nods of agreement. For Frank, this wasn't a moment of triumph, but a chance to redirect the spotlight toward values too often overlooked. As the event drew to a close, Tyler and his friends, the young men whose earlier mockery had sparked this gathering, prepared to leave Carson Springs, their hearts heavy with humility. The day had been a lesson in judgment, one they hadn't expected but would never forget. Tyler approached Captain Riley, his posture less cocky now, his eyes searching for understanding. "Sir, how did you know what happened last night? How did you find us?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and remorse. Riley glanced toward Jason, the young gas station attendant who'd witnessed the confrontation. "My nephew works here," Riley explained, a hint of pride in his tone. "After seeing how you treated Staff Sergeant Mallerie, he called me. I was already planning to visit this weekend, but I brought a few friends and came early." Tyler nodded, his face a canvas of reflection. "I'm glad he did," he admitted. "We needed that lesson." Riley's expression softened, a teacher recognizing a student's growth. "We all do sometimes," he said. "The important thing is whether we learn from it." The exchange was brief, but it carried the weight of accountability, a reminder that mistakes, when met with humility, could pave the way for redemption. In the weeks that followed, Carson Springs settled back into its quiet rhythm, but the town was forever changed. Frank Mallerie continued his routine, rising at dawn, tending to his aging truck with meticulous care, helping neighbors without being asked. Yet now, when he pulled into the gas station or stopped at the diner, people stood a little straighter, their nods carrying unspoken gratitude. "Thank you for your service," they'd say, their voices soft but sincere. Frank would nod back, his smile faint but genuine, never lingering on the praise. The Hillside Gas and Market became a pilgrimage site of sorts, its new sign and a framed photograph of Frank in his Marine dress uniform drawing visitors from beyond Carson Springs. The photo, hung beside the register, bore a simple caption, "Where a hero once stood silent." Tourists and veterans alike stopped by, hoping to glimpse the man whose story had rippled across social media and veterans' networks, a quiet hero who'd briefly captured the nation's attention. The town's welcome sign was updated to read, "Home of Frank Mallerie, Veteran in Honor," a change Frank had quietly protested but ultimately accepted when the mayor explained it was about more than just him. It was about the values he embodied. Jason Riley, the young attendant whose call to his uncle had set the day's events in motion, found his own path altered. Inspired by Frank's example, he enlisted in the Marine Corps, determined to carry forward the legacy of quiet strength. Before leaving for boot camp, he penned an article for the local paper, his words later picked up by national outlets. I saw firsthand how silence can be more powerful than any shout, he wrote, his prose earnest and unpolished. Mr. Mallerie didn't need to defend himself because true strength doesn't crave validation. It's rooted in actions, not words. His words resonated, spreading Frank's story further and cementing Carson Springs as a place that cherished its unsung heroes. The town's transformation was subtle but profound, marked by three reflections that captured the essence of Frank's story. Not everyone needs applause, some just need a road to travel and a reason to keep their silence. Honor isn't worn on the chest, but in how you carry yourself when no one's watching. And never underestimate the quiet ones, for their silence often holds the weightiest words. Perhaps the greatest tribute to Frank wasn't the highway sign or the framed photo, but the community's newfound attentiveness to those who, like him, moved through life with quiet dignity. Neighbors began to notice the unassuming figures among them, the ones who spoke little but did much, and offered them the respect they had always deserved. In Carson Springs, justice might have been delayed, but it was never absent. And Frank's story became a beacon for those who believed in doing what was right, no matter how quietly they walked.